And you'll notice if I click in an empty area here, I can rotate my model freely. If I hold down the Alt key and then click in an empty area, I can move my object up or down, left or right. If I hold down the Alt key, start to move my object, and then let go of the Alt key, I'll switch over to scale. That way I can scale my object up and down. So let's review. Clicking in an empty area will rotate your object. Holding down Alt and clicking in an empty area will move your object. And then while you're moving, if you let go of Alt, you'll switch to scale. You might also notice that you have 3 buttons here on the right-hand side of your canvas. This will also allow you to move, scale, and rotate by simply clicking on these icons. Let's take a look at the tool icon located in the tool palette. I'm going to click on these double arrows to open up my right-hand shelf, and then I'm going to go up to my tool pull down, and then grab this little swatch and dock this over onto the right-hand side. You notice that I have an icon here called Tool. If I click on that, it's going to open up a much bigger shelf, and inside this shelf we have a few areas. The first area are custom meshes that you've been working on, also any 2.5D brushes. The second area is designated for the 3D primitives native to ZBrush. The third area is going to be for brushes much like highlighter brushes or filters that you might find in other programs like Photoshop. Things like highlight, erase, smudge, all sorts of different brushes that we'll talk about later. The fourth area down here will allow you to load a tool, save a tool, import a tool, or even export a tool. That'll take me straight into my ZBrush work area with a blank canvas. Now you may or may not have your tool palette docked over here to the side, so let's quickly talk about how we can dock a palette. I'm going to go ahead and click on these double arrows right here to close this palette down. Then I'm going to go up to this main menu bar here and click on Tool. You notice when I click on that, it opens up the tool palette. You'll also notice that inside the tool palette we have a little circle with a line through it. This little swatch allows us to dock palettes. So I'll go ahead and click on that swatch, and you notice it'll dock my tool palette over here on the left. If you want to dock it over on the right, all you have to do is open up that shelf, grab that little circle with the swatch, and then drag it over. I'll then go ahead and click on the double arrows to close down this shelf over on the left. So now we want to add in a 3D tool to work with. So I notice I have a 3D sphere here in my tool palette. I'll click on that, and then I'm going to click and drag inside my canvas. Before I do anything else, I'm going to hit the letter T. Once I do that, I have made this 3D sphere editable. But there is one more step we need to do before we can start sculpting. You'll notice again up here at the top of the tool palette, we have an option called Make Polymesh 3D. I want to click on that option. We'll talk a little bit more about what a Polymesh 3D, what a 3D primitive, and what different objects and tools are inside ZBrush. But for right now, don't worry about that. Just make it a Polymesh 3D. Bring your cursor over to your new Polymesh 3D, and then click and drag. And you notice that you'll start sculpting right away. Again, as we learned earlier, if I click out in an empty area, I can rotate this, and then sculpt in another position. Quick little trick is to hold down the Alt key. The Alt key will push into the surface. Now, as we move forward with other tutorials, I don't want you to think of the Alt key as just the button that pushes in on a surface. You can think of it as the button that reverses many actions inside ZBrush. So in the future, if I'm using a brush that adds highlight to a specific texture, holding down the Alt key might add a darker area. But for right now, it reverses our brush and pushes in. I can let go of Alt to again draw on the surface, pulling it out. Often when working in ZBrush, you'll work symmetrically, which means you'll have your symmetry option turned on, and as you work on one side of your model, the other side of your model is affected in the same way. In this case, I have a head that isn't symmetrical, One side has clearly been sculpted, while the other side remains the same. What we want to do is make sure both sides are symmetrical. To take this information on one side and push it over to the other side, we simply have to open up our tool palette, open up our deformations pull down, and then select this option called Smart Resim. But before we click that, there's a few steps we have to look at first. The first thing we want to do is mask off the side of our model that we want to mirror over to the other side. As we do this, we want to make sure our model is facing us straight on. So to do that, I'll rotate my model and then simply hold the Shift key as I do it. You'll notice it'll snap into a straight on view. I'll then hold down the Control key and click and drag to make a mask over the side of the model that I want to copy over to the other. Then you'll also notice in the Smart Resim option, you have the option of clicking X, Y, or Z. This is the axes that we want to mirror across. So in this case, it is X, so I'll leave X turned on, which is the default. Then I'll click Smart Resim. As I do that, ZBrush will take a moment to think about it, and then take all this information and mirror it over to the other side. Now that the information has been passed from one side of the model over to the other, I'll hold down Control, click and drag an empty area to clear my mask. Now that my model is symmetrical, I can continue working on it with symmetry. So I'll tap the X key to turn on my X symmetry, and then continue working. Often while working in ZBrush, you're going to want to sculpt symmetrically. The keyboard shortcut for turning on symmetry is the letter X. When I press X, by default, symmetry is along the X-axis, which is good in this case because this character's face is symmetrical along the X-axis. So if I grab my Move brush, whatever I do to one side will be affected and mirrored over to the other side. Your symmetry options can be found in the Transform palette. So if we go up to Transform, grab the palette handle and dock that over on the right, you'll notice that we have this button Activate Symmetry pressed. And then you'll also notice that X symmetry is the active symmetry. Let's work with another 3D tool to demonstrate Y and Z symmetry. I'm going to hit the letter T to drop this model to canvas, and then hit Control N to clear. Let's go into our tool palette, and let's select a 3D cube. I'll click and drag to draw that into my canvas, hit the Edit button to make that live. Let's go into our tool palette and click Make Polymesh 3D so we can do some sculpting on this. And then I'll hit Control D a few times just to divide this cube, so we have a little bit more resolution to work with. Now again, you'll notice we have our Transform palette docked to the right. I'll click Activate Symmetry, and as we saw with the face, by default, X symmetry is turned on. I'm going to grab my standard brush for this example, so we can sculpt along the X-axis. Hit Control Z to undo that. I'm going to turn off X and turn on Y, and now you'll notice that I'm sculpting along the Y-axis. I can turn on X and Y at the same time so that we're working with both X and Y. Let's undo that. Let's turn off X, Y, and just turn on Z. So if I come here to the top, you'll notice that you've done some sculpting along the Z-axis. And as we saw with X and Y, we can turn on X, Y, and Z all at the same time, and then sculpt on all axes. Make some interesting patterns this way. Let's Control Z to undo that. I'm going to turn off Y and Z, so we're just working with X symmetry. And now I want you to take notice of this button M. This stands for Mirror Symmetry. Currently with Mirror Symmetry on, whatever I do to one side will be mirrored identically to the other side. If I turn Mirror Symmetry off and do this same sculpt, you'll notice that it's pushing in a positive direction on this side, but then it's moving in a negative direction on this side. So it's essentially following the stroke's direction. So depending on what you want as far as your results, you might turn mirror on or off. So let's turn that back on. Now let's talk about radial symmetry. If you press this little R, you're going to turn on radial symmetry. You'll also notice next to the R button we have a slider. This slider will designate how many points we're actually working with. So I'm going to turn this up to somewhere around 4. And I'm going to turn on Z symmetry. And let's choose something like our magnify brush. So now you notice I have 4 points running along the Z-axis, which I can use to inflate these 4 corners. We'll do the same thing here on the bottom. So you can see there's a lot of different interesting things you can do working with radial symmetry. Let's take a look of radial symmetry on a polysphere. So I'll clear this, go to my tool palette, select a sphere 3D, click and draw to drag that into my canvas, hit edit, and then again under the tool palette let's click make polymesh 3D. And then one more time I'm going to hit Control D just a few times to divide this to add a little bit more resolution to this sphere. Okay, let's click Activate Symmetry here in our Transform palette, or just hit the letter X. I'm going to turn off X and turn on Z. Click R for radial, and let's turn these points up. Somewhere around 30 should be good. I'm going to switch back to my standard brush. And now we can have fun sculpting in some interesting patterns.